Have you ever thought about like what psychologists are allowed to say, when they're advertising, doing public stuff?
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
probably more regulated than people think.
Right.
Like, I bet there's some rule about having to put their license number on every single ad they put out.
Oh, absolutely. In most cases, yeah, that's a definite must-do. And that's really just the start. There's so much more to it.
So let's dive in. What are these legal and ethical rules that shape how psychologists, present themselves out there?
Okay, well, think of it like this. We're about to uncover the rule book that keeps everything transparent and helps everyone trust the profession. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on two biggies.
Yeah.
The California Code of Regulations, we'll just call it CCR from now on, and of course the APA Ethics Code.
Okay, so CCR and ethics code, got it. Now, why should our listeners care about this? Like, what's the takeaway for them?
Well, think about it. Have you ever looked at a psychologist profile online
Well,
or heard one being interviewed?
sure.
Or maybe you're even thinking about seeing one yourself.
Knowing these standards is important. It's about being informed and understanding what's in place to protect you.
Right. These rules aren't just for the professionals, they're for us too.
Exactly. And to get the full picture, we've pulled together info from several important sources. We've got sections of that CCR we mentioned, the Business and Professions Code, and of course the American Psychological Association's Ethics Code. Looking at it all together, it gives us a well-rounded understanding.
So today, we're navigating these rules, finding the big stuff, and explaining it in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, making it clear and hopefully interesting for everyone.
Right, because this stuff matters.
Absolutely. Let's start with something super basic. How a psychologist tells the world who they are. The California Code of Regulations, specifically Section 1380.6, is very clear about this. Any licensed psychologist has to include their license number on anything, like any advertising, any public directory listing, anything where they're soliciting clients.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's their own name, a business name, whatever, right, even a group practice, or if they're under a corporation.
Hmm,
That license number needs to be there.
got it. So next time I see a psychologist advertising, boom, license number front and center.
Exactly. It seems simple, but it's a big deal. It lets anyone check if the psychologist's credentials are legit. It's all about accountability, especially in a profession built on trust.
Makes sense. So are there any exceptions to that license number rule?
Actually, yeah, there are a few. Like if a psychologist works for a government organization or a nonprofit that mainly does research or education, or
Okay.
provides services that a community or professional board already oversees, they're exempt.
So in those cases, there's already another layer of like checks and balances in place.
Exactly. Now, what about when a psychologist is actually doing their job, not just advertising?
Good point.
Well, CCR Section 1396.4a covers that. It says whenever a licensed psychologist is doing anything related to their profession, paid or unpaid, they have to make it clear that they are a psychologist. No wiggle room there.
And this isn't just for like fully licensed folks, right? What about those who are registered psychological associates? What do they have to do?
Oh, you're right. CCR Section 1396.4b
Yeah.
lays out the rules for them. They always have to identify themselves as a registered psychological associate, both to their patients or clients, and this is important, to their employer or supervisor when doing any psychology-related work.
Right. So total transparency no matter what.
That's the idea. Now, switching gears a bit, what about ensuring a psychologist is being totally honest about who they are and what they've accomplished, qualification-wise?
Yeah, that's crucial.
Right. Well, that's where CCR Section 1396.2 comes in. It says straight up that psychologists can't misrepresent their qualifications, their affiliations, what they do, or even the qualifications or purpose of any institution, organization, product, or service they're linked with. It's about preventing any kind of trickery.
So like if a psychologist lists their degrees, they better be real, right? They can't just make stuff up.
Exactly. They can only list degrees they've actually earned and that are relevant to their work as psychologists. The regulations even specifically mention that calling yourself a PhD candidate when you haven't actually got the PhD is misleading because it makes people think you've achieved a level of education that you haven't yet.
That's a good clarification. Now, what about honorary degrees or degrees in things that aren't psychology? Are those okay to list?
Nope. The rules are pretty clear on that. Unless the APA, the American Psychological Association, specifically recognizes a non-psychology degree as equivalent to a psychology degree, it shouldn't be listed if you're presenting yourself as a psychologist.
Yeah.
And honorary degrees Definitely a no-go in a professional context.
Okay, so stick to the real earned degrees that are relevant to your work. What about mentioning you're part of, like professional groups, like say being a member of APA?
Yeah, you can totally list those memberships, but there's a catch. You can't do it in a way that makes people think the organization is sponsoring you or endorsing your work, like saying you're good at what you do. It's just a fact. You're a member. That's it.
So, no implying you've got their stamp of approval. Now, what happens if a psychologist does misrepresent themselves or their license? Are there, like, actual penalties for that?
Oh, for sure. The Business and Professions Code, Section 2960, gets into the consequences. It says the licensing board can flat out refuse to give someone a license or registration, or they can give it with certain conditions. And they can even suspend or completely take away a license or registration if the person is found guilty of what they call unprofessional conduct.
Wow, so the board has some serious power there. And
Yeah.
what exactly counts as unprofessional conduct when we're talking about misrepresentation?
Well, Section 2960C specifically lists fraudulently or neglectfully misrepresenting the type or status of license or registration actually held as part of that definition. So it's not just a small mistake, it's a big deal with potentially serious consequences for a psychologist's career.
Right. It's about maintaining the integrity of the profession. So we've covered being upfront about who you are and not making false claims. What about advertising? Like, what rules do psychologists have to follow when they're putting themselves out there to attract clients?
Okay, so CCR Section 1397 says licensed psychologists can advertise their services, but here's the thing, it has to be within what they're actually qualified to do, and it has to follow what Business and Professions Code Section 651 says. Basically, they can't encourage people to use more psychology services than they actually need.
Yeah, that makes sense. No one should be pushing unnecessary services no matter what field they're in. What about the specific claims they make in the ads? Are there any rules about what they can say?
Absolutely. Business and Professions Code Section 17508A is super relevant here. It says anyone doing business and advertising to people in California can't make claims that are misleading or untrue. This includes saying things are based on evidence when they're not, comparing their services to others in a misleading way, or basically just stating things as facts when they're not.
So a psychologist can't just make up statistics or oversell how amazing their methods are.
Exactly. And the Ethics Code also backs this up in Standard 5.01b, which says psychologists can't make public statements that are false, deceptive, or fraudulent. And it lists a bunch of things this applies to, like their training, experience, qualifications, affiliations, the services they provide, what their services are based on, their fees, and even their research. It's a pretty thorough list to prevent anyone from being misled.
Wow, it covers a lot of ground. What about if a psychologist has other people promoting their practice? Are they still responsible for what's being said?
Oh yeah, for sure. Standard 5.02a of the Ethics Code is clear on that. It says even if they hire someone else to create or put out statements promoting their practice, products, or activities, the psychologist is still responsible for what those statements say. So they can't just blame a marketing company if things get out of hand.
Got it. So they can't just pass the buck. What about paying for news coverage? Is that something they're allowed to do?
Nope. Standard 5.002b specifically forbids psychologists from paying anyone in the press, radio, TV, or other media to get publicity in a news story. It's about keeping news reporting honest and making sure it's based on facts, not on someone paying for good press. I mean, think about it. You want to be able to trust that a news report is objective,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to something as important as mental health.
For sure. You don't want to feel like you're being manipulated. So that protects the integrity of news. Now, what if a psychologist does pay for an ad, like a legit one? Any rules there?
Yes. Standard 5.02c says any paid ad about a psychologist's work has to be clearly labeled as an ad. It can't look like it's just a regular news story or an endorsement. It's all about transparency.
Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about descriptions of educational programs, like workshops or training. Are there rules about how psychologists describe those?
You bet. Ethics Code Standard 5.03 covers descriptions of workshops and non-degree programs. It says psychologists who are in charge of those programs have to make sure the descriptions are accurate, like who the program is for, what people will learn, who's presenting, and how much it costs.
So no hyping it up or misleading people just to get them to sign up.
Right. They give a good example. If a workshop is advertised as interactive, it should actually involve lots of interaction, not just be someone lecturing the whole time.
Right, it's got to be what it says it is.
Exactly. Now let's talk testimonials, which are everywhere these days. What are the rules for psychologists asking for testimonials from their clients? Okay, Ethics Code Standard 5.05 puts some pretty clear limits on that. Psychologists can't ask for testimonials from current therapy clients or patients or from anyone who might be easily influenced because of their situation.
That makes sense. It's about protecting people who might feel pressured, especially given the sensitive nature of therapy.
Exactly. And they list a bunch of things that can make someone vulnerable to that kind of pressure, like insecurities, emotional problems, not having enough information, or just feeling in awe of the professional. All of that can make it hard to say no to a request for a testimonial.
Can you give an example of where asking for a testimonial would be a big no-no?
Yeah, they talk about a supervisor asking a supervisee for a testimonial to use in advertising. That's likely not okay because the supervisee probably feels obligated to say yes, because of the power dynamic in that relationship.
Right, it's about avoiding those imbalances. So what about psychologists directly trying to get new clients, like going out and soliciting business in person? Any rules about that?
Yep, Ethics Code Standard 5.06 talks about that. Psychologists, or anyone working for them, can't go up to people and try to get them to become clients if it's uninvited and they're current or potential therapy clients, or if they're vulnerable to being pressured. It's all about respecting people's space and choices.
So uninvited is the key word there.
Yeah, but there are a couple exceptions. They can talk to other professionals if it's to help a current client, and they can provide services after a disaster or as part of a community outreach program.
Can you give an example of what would be totally off limits for in-person solicitation?
To give a pretty extreme example,
Yeah.
a psychologist following the police to a crime scene and handing out business cards to victims. That's definitely not okay because those people are obviously in a vulnerable state.
Yeah, that's way over the line. So what about more normal situations? Like if someone asks for the psychologist's business card, is that solicitation?
No, that's totally fine. If someone asks for your information, it's perfectly normal to give them a card. And sending out brochures or info about your services is also generally okay, as long as you're not targeting vulnerable people in a pushy way.
Okay, so it's about being respectful and not taking advantage of people.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about media appearances, like when a psychologist gives advice on TV or online. Any ethical things they need to think about?
Yes. Ethics Code Standard 5.04 says that when psychologists give advice in public lectures, demos, radio or TV shows, online, or anywhere else, their advice has to be based on their professional knowledge and experience, and it has to follow the ethics code. Plus, they can't act like they're forming a professional relationship with everyone watching or listening.
So if a psychologist is giving advice on a talk show, they need to make it clear they're not everyone's therapist.
Exactly. It's about giving good information without making it seem personal.
Right, so no one gets the wrong idea. And does this apply to, like, telehealth sessions with current clients?
Actually, no. This standard doesn't apply if the psychologist is already working with the person professionally.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's wrap up with publication credit. This might be more for psychologists who do research, but it's still an important part of ethics. What are the main rules about that?
Right, so Ethics Code Standards 8.11 and 8.12 are all about publication credit. Standard 8.11 is really clear about plagiarism. Psychologists can't present someone else's work as their own, even if they cite the source sometimes. What they present has to be their own work.
Yeah, that's a basic rule in any field. So what if multiple people work on a publication? How do they figure out who gets credit and in what order?
Well, Standard 8.12a says psychologists should only take credit, like being listed as an author, for work they actually did or contributed to significantly. And 8.12b says the order of authors, with the main author usually listed first, should reflect how much each person contributed. Smaller contributions, like giving advice or data, are usually mentioned in a footnote or at the beginning of the publication.
So the more you do, the more credit you get. What about when students' dissertations become publications? How does that work?
Good question. Standard 815.1c says that, except in really unusual situations, a student should be the main author on any publication based on their dissertation. This recognizes that the student did most of the work, even if faculty helped them along the way.
This has been a lot of information. So for our listeners, what are the main things to remember about how psychologists should act in public and in their advertising?
I think the big things are to always be honest and accurate in what you say publicly, know the rules about advertising and getting clients, and remember the ethics that guide professional behavior. These rules and ethics exist for a reason.
Right, it's about protecting the public.
Exactly. It's about making sure the profession is transparent and accountable and keeping the public's trust in psychology.
And knowing these guidelines helps our listeners too, right?
Absolutely. It helps people make good choices about psychological services and recognize ethical practices.
So everyone wins. Now, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. All these rules for psychologists, what do they tell you about how much responsibility and trust society puts on them?
Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility.
It really is. And how might these rules, or similar ones, affect how other professions present themselves and how we see them in the future? It's something to think about as you go through life and see how professionals act in public.
Definitely food for thought.
That's it for our deep dive this time. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for having me.